Welcome back, fellow goblins. My name's Lila. This is Mingo, the scaleless white-sided rat snake. He's named Mingo because it's short for flamingo because he's pink. And today I'll be talking about scaleless reptiles and if they are or are not ethical. So the first and most important thing I cannot stress enough is that not all scaleless reptiles are created equally. There are three main ones that I'm going to talk about, and that is scaleless ball pythons, scaleless rat snakes and corn snakes, and scaleless bearded dragons, also known as silky bearded dragons. And I'm going to start off with, of course, scaleless rat snakes and corn snakes because I have Mingo here as a good example of a scaleless rat snake. So Mingo is a scaleless white-sided rat snake, and Mingo doesn't have really any scales with the exception of his head, and you can also see he has ventral scales, and that's going to make a big difference. So I'm going to get into that here in a sec. So the first thing I want to mention to differentiate between scaleless rat snakes, corn snakes, and things like scaleless bearded dragons and scaleless ball pythons is that scaleless rat snakes and scaleless corn snakes actually occur naturally, and that is because of a genetic mutation. A genetic mutation is different from a morph. Scaleless ball pythons come from a morph, which I'll talk about more when I talk about scaleless ball pythons, but scaleless rat snakes come from a natural genetic mutation. And this can actually be found in different snakes as well. A good example is rattlesnakes. Certain rattlesnakes actually also carry a natural scaleless genetic mutation, which again, they retain those ventral scales as well. The main thing I want to establish when talking about a natural genetic mutation versus morphs is that morphs are a genetic mutation. However, the difference between this genetic mutation and a scaleless ball python's genetic mutation is that a scaleless ball python is a morph that is created by specifically breeding for that genetic mutation over several generations of breeding. Specifically, it's from breeding scaleless head ball pythons, resulting in some of the offspring being completely scaleless. The difference between that and rat snakes and corn snakes is that this genetic mutation occurs naturally in the wild. You will not see scaleless ball pythons in the wild because they have been specifically selectively bred for that over several generations, whereas scaleless rat snakes and corn snakes are found this way in the wild, in addition to a couple of other species. Again, I mentioned rattlesnakes, and this is very clear when you look at, again, the retention of those ventral scales. This is incredibly important for maintaining their survival in the wild because these ventral scales provide a ton of support for existing in harsh environments because they move by scooting their body along the ground, and they're not going to be able to do that properly without those ventral scales, and it also provides a layer of protection. Additionally, like I said, they do retain those scales on their face, which provides a little bit of protection as well. And the main difference between these guys and things like scaleless ball pythons is that their care is essentially the same to any other rat snake or corn snake. There is very, very little difference in their husbandry because it is naturally occurring. So it doesn't affect their care requirements. The only thing you're going to have to look out for is making sure that they really stay hydrated. That's the main thing, and making sure that there's nothing that could potentially puncture that skin because they lack those scales. So you're going to want to make sure that you don't have anything. I mean, this really goes for any enclosure, but when you're cluttering your enclosure, make sure there's nothing sharp or pointy that could potentially puncture that skin. But overall, these guys are naturally occurring. They are, of course, bred for this trait now, which is similar to scaleless ball pythons in that they're bred for it, but it wasn't something that was created through selective breeding. It does occur naturally, and that's abundantly clear by the retention of those ventral scales. Again, I cannot stress that enough. Now I'm going to talk about scaleless ball pythons. So I talked about scaleless rat snakes and corn snakes and how their husbandry remains very much the same. These guys do not suffer because of this genetic mutation. Their care is the same. You know, the chances of them getting injured, especially in captivity, is very slim, and really nothing about their quality of life changes. This is not the same for scaleless ball pythons. Something I do want to stress really quick, and this is going to be something that I stress continuously on my YouTube channel, is that ethics is very subjective. So the way I see things might not be the way you see things. And I am always open to have those discussions because, like I said, ethics are subjective and we all have different perspectives. So it's not a matter of I'm right, you're wrong. This is simply what I know based upon the facts and the peer-reviewed sources presented to me. Scaleless ball pythons do not have these ventral scales. They don't have them. So they are entirely scaleless, meaning that they have no form of protection. Additionally, the habitat that ball pythons reside in is much more hot and much more humid than that of North American corn and rat snakes. And that is going to make a difference as well because they live in very very hot, humid environments compared to corn snakes and rat snakes. They require a lot more humidity and they feel more secure when there is an exceptional amount of clutter. And that's of course in my experience and also based upon their behavior in the wild. And so when they have no ventral scales, and that's their primary form of movement, is scooting along using those abdominal muscles to scoot along the bottom of their enclosure, the lack of those ventral scales makes their life exceptionally more difficult, and they are much more prone to injury. They are much more prone to health issues just in general. And overall, I don't think we should be breeding them for that reason. One of the main things I cannot stress enough when we talk about scaleless ball pythons and that lack of ventral scales is that the way that snakes actually thermoregulate is by absorbing belly heat from an overhead heat source, typically on something like slate, in order to heat themselves. And that leads to a lot of problems when it comes to adjusting your care for a scaleless ball python because they lack those ventral scales. They can very easily get burnt, and it makes it substantially more difficult to thermoregulate because they are essentially naked down there. And another thing is that they just lack all of that natural protection on their belly, so it's much more easy to get injured in such a vulnerable area where they are using all of those muscles to move around their enclosure. It's much more easy to get caught on something or to like rip the skin open. Whoa! Oh, he got huffy at me. Like ball pythons are also like notorious for shedding problems due to their humidity and people having a difficult time maintaining their humidity in captivity. And this is even more so an issue when it comes to scaleless ball pythons. Again, I'm not saying that it can't be done, but it is substantially more difficult and does lower that overall quality of life. And in general, I don't think that we should be breeding scaleless ball pythons for all the reasons that I've listed. They have no form of protection that scaled snakes have. And this species in particular really needs those ventral scales. And the last species I'm going to talk about is the worst one of all of the three that I've mentioned, and that is scaleless bearded dragons, or silkies, or silkback bearded dragons. I think silky bearded dragons are a money grab at the detriment of the animal. Bearded dragons have very complex care compared to the other two animals I've listed. They require high UVB, a high basking spot, and a lot of space, and they cannot thermoregulate properly without the scales. They cannot protect themselves without the scales. They have a lot of difficulty shedding without the scales. They can get sunburnt very easily without the scales. They can get dehydrated very easily without the scales. So overall, this is a species that we should not be breeding to not have scales. And for that reason, I think that silkback bearded dragons are highly unethical and something that we need to stop supporting completely. And this as well does not occur in the wild. They are bred for money at the detriment of the animal. There's no reason to do it. There's no functionality. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you think, and I will see you next time. Bye.